My name is Nkonye and this is my project for cs50. I am a Barbadian living on the island of Barbados, and I am currently a university student. This is a dress-up game. You might be wondering, why would I submit this dress-up game when the objective of this project is something that will go beyond cs50 and impact my world or the wider community? I feel this project impacts my wider community because it's not just a princess. It's not just a model wearing different clothes. It's a skeleton. A very spooky and fabulous skeleton, but a skeleton nonetheless. And this is to show for young girls who are normally the target of these kind of dress-up games that their model could be more than just a lady. It can be whatever they want, which helps boost their self-esteem, their way of thinking, and broaden their imaginations. They could write stories about the skeletons, do whatever they want with the skeleton. But in this game, you can dress her up. And this really helps little girls see that there's more opportunities. Yes, you can change your skin color. Yes, you can change your clothes. You can even dress up boys now in these online dress-up games. But they're always some kind of human. In the future, I'd like to expand upon this dress-up game. Soon it'll be a zombie, a ghost, and another spooky skeleton they could dress up to add to their imagination, their wider world of what their models and what their stories can be. Thank you.